So with the remaining time, I thought I'd give a short lecture on marine resources, which is actually covered in some detail in your book. For the purposes of this lecture, I'm only going to focus in on a tiny little aspect of marine resources, which is actually a big, big basket full of issues, but I'm mostly going to focus here on fisheries, which ties into our discussion of the biology of the oceans to some extent. And then on Wednesday and Friday of this week, the last two lectures will focus on climate change and possible causes and futures for that. Sure. So today we're going to talk about marine resources. Your book goes into this in quite a bit of detail. And there are lots of resources in the ocean, some of which you may not normally think of as being resources. There are physical resources, things like mineral deposits. We talked a little bit about the manganese nodules on the seafloor and how that was kind of a fake resource in the ocean. But there are real resources like petroleum, as seen in these oil rigs off the coast of Huntington Beach in Orange County. Natural gas, methane. There are biological resources, fish, of course, but also kelp and many other organisms in the ocean are of economic value when they can be gathered. And there are non-extractive resources, which is perhaps seems a little non-intuitive, but just the ability to take materials across the ocean with relatively little expenditure of energy or money is actually an important resource in the ocean. It's something that's a matter of concern if that gets compromised. And so transportation, recreation, waste disposal, those are all major concerns for and resources in the ocean. The ability to solve our pollution problems using the classic mechanism, which is that the solution to pollution is dilution. The ocean is a big place, and for a long time it was thought that you could just dump stuff into the ocean without having to worry about it. In LA, we've kind of learned the hard way that you can't necessarily do that all the time. We have beach closures essentially after every rainstorm because the runoff has too many nutrients in it, has things like fecal bacteria that can cause infections. And so the ability to actually deal with waste has some economic ramifications, as well as the value of the ocean as a place to dispose of it. Now, for all of these types, we can actually divide them up into not just what type of resource is it, but what is the time scale of the recovery of that resource. So we can think of renewable resources in the ocean as things that on some human time scale will come back even if we use them. So things like seaweed, which here's an aerial photo of seaweed farms off the coast of Japan. Seaweed grows pretty fast. Off the coast of Southern California, there is commercial kelp harvesting. Kelp grows unbelievably fast. And so those can be harvested every year. The resource will come back as long as it's managed with some care. And of course, things like wind are natural features of the ocean that regenerate themselves very quickly, even without our interference. And then there are non-renewable resources. And here it's key to remember that non-renewable doesn't mean that it never renews itself. It just means that the renewal takes place on a time scale that's long compared to human economic interests. So things like oil, they've been placed there over geological time, and oil is presumably being generated today, but it's on geological time scales. If we take all the oil that's available out of the seafloor, we're not going to be able to go back 10 years later and get a significant amount of more oil. Instead, we'd have to wait, hundreds of thousands or millions of years for that resource to build up again. So that's long on the human time scale, so we call it a non-renewable resource, even though it is dynamic in some sense. Okay. So I'm going to focus in on biological resources. And these face some of the same issues that other resources, other extractive resources in the ocean do. And the big picture is that we live on a world where the demands on our environment are increasing. The population of our planet is about 6.8 billion as of today or yesterday. And that is going up. That number is going up by something like actually 78 million people a year, something like that. This is a model based on demographic records from the U.S. Census Bureau, but nonetheless, these have worked out reasonably well on short time scales in the past. So with some confidence, we know that the population is increasing at something like 1% per year. And 80 million people is enough to fill up the Rose Bowl 80 million people a year is enough to fill up the Rose Bowl every 10 hours to its full capacity for a UCLA game of something like 93,000 people. So every 10 hours, there's a new Rose Bowl full of people on the planet, and they all, of course, need to be fed. They need to have economic resources available to them. And so our kind of load on the planet just from that increase in the number of people is tending to increase, all else being equal, which of course it isn't. So the question is, relative to this sort of load that we place on the environment and its increase, what does the ocean provide to us, and what is its ability to sustain that increase on load over time? Well, it turns out that the ocean provides lots of important things to us, and in particular, the biological resources turn out to be very important. A significant fraction of all the protein in human diets actually comes ultimately from some underwater resource. Here I'm lumping in oceanic resources with freshwater resources, but mostly this is the ocean, something like 2/3 ocean, 1/3 freshwater, or 3/4 ocean, 1/4 freshwater, somewhere in between there. And in order to get those resources from the ocean, of course, we extract them. We extract biological resources from the ocean, by which I mean, crudely speaking, fish, but of course this includes fish, shellfish, invertebrates of other kinds, seaweed, other food resources from the ocean. And that total harvest, as best it can be estimated, was something like 140 million metric tons in 2005, which is the highest ever. In fact, as far as we can tell, that harvest is increasing every year. Most of this is going to direct human consumption, but some of it isn't, particularly in the United States and other developed economies. Fish protein is a convenient way to actually feed more valuable protein sources. So fish meal might be used to feed chickens or cattle, for instance, on feedlots. So some of the protein that's harvested from the ocean is actually used for other means. Now, if we look in terms of what the most abundant things harvested from the ocean are, some of them are recognizable organisms to you, and some of them probably aren't. Well, maybe none of them are, but the most commonly harvested organism is this thing called an anchoveta, which I think is mostly found in the eastern Pacific Ocean. It's like a little sardine thing. Not individually very valuable, but again, it's a protein source that, for instance, can be used to feed other organisms. If you've ever had fish sticks or a fish sandwich from McDonald's, chances are you've had Alaska pollock. It's a very common whitefish. Eaten directly, skipjack tuna is very commonly found in canned tuna, herring, and the other fish on that list, for the most part, are things you would know about. This guy, the large head hailtail, I would encourage you to look up the Wikipedia entry on that. That's a weird looking fish. And it's kind of surprising that we harvest that much of it. I wonder what they call it in the market, because I have never in the fish market seen something labeled large head hairtail. In terms of which countries are responsible for harvesting fish from the ocean, actually there's a little bit of a caveat that has to go here. And in fact, this caveat falls for all of the statistics I'm giving you in this lecture. In terms of the tonnage of material gathered from the ocean, the dominant player is China. And there's a little bit of a problem in that people who study these things seem to take the numbers for harvest from China with a strong grain of salt. These are reported by the government, and some people seem not to trust them very much. So the size of that large bar is perhaps a little bit up in the air. The other bars are perhaps better known. But nonetheless, it certainly appears that China is the most intense harvester of fishes from the ocean. If we look farther down the list, the United States is up there. Japan, which perhaps is commonly thought of as a major harvester of marine biological resources, is up there. But there are a couple ones that maybe don't immediately jump out as, oh yeah, I knew that was a big fishing country. So for instance, Peru or Chile, which aren't terribly populous countries, and we perhaps don't think of as being big fishing countries. So an interesting question to ask is, what's up with that? It makes sense. China is the most populous country. It has a large coastal area. Of course it's going to be a big fish harvester. But Peru, Chile, what's up with those guys? Why are they such big players in terms of harvesting biological resources from the ocean? Does anybody want to offer a guess as to why? If you're a fisherman, why would Peru be a good place to live? Okay, it's on the coast. That's kind of a requirement, yes. So Bolivia is not a big fishing country because it doesn't really have a coastline. But there are many coastal countries that don't have big fish harvests. Yeah? Yes, upwelling. That's exactly right. So Peru and Chile are on the west coast of South America, facing the Pacific Ocean, which is the biggest ocean basin. And if we just look at the temperature of the ocean water, you can see there's this big area of unusually cold water right off the coast of the southern part of South America. That includes the equatorial upwelling and west coastal upwelling. And of course, this is also a region that has the Peru current, which is a cold eastern boundary current in the southern Pacific Ocean. Cold water, easy to mix vertically, not a big density difference between water at the surface and water at some depth. These are regions where it's favorable to bring nutrients up into the surface water, and so they tend to have relatively intense biological cycles. There's lots of nutrients for photosynthesis to occur, so there are lots of zooplankton eating the phytoplankton, and there are lots of fish eating the zooplankton, and so on and so forth. So it turns out that Peru and Chile are actually relatively rich fishing grounds because of their location on the west coasts of continents facing the Pacific Ocean. You might also expect, for instance, that a country like Namibia in Southwest Africa would also be a fairly rich fishing country, and that's true. Namibia actually is a very productive fishery as well, or at least historically had been. In terms of regions of the ocean, I don't actually get a whole lot out of this, but it does tell you some things. First of all, the most productive part of the ocean today, as of 2006, is the Pacific. The top 4 bars there are all, the top 3 bars there are all the Pacific, and particularly the northwestern Pacific. What's kind of surprising here is how small the bars associated with the Atlantic are. Southwest Atlantic, Northwest Atlantic, Northeast Atlantic. The Atlantic is a much smaller ocean, of course, than the Pacific, so it makes sense that there might be less fish there all told. But there's actually a broader story there, which I'll get to a little bit later, that has to do simply with the fact that this is what the fisheries look like in 2006. But if you went back 50 or 100 years, those bars would have actually looked very different. The productivity of the Atlantic is, in fact, declining as a function of time. Okay. So we've looked at which fish are most commonly harvested. We've looked at which countries do the most harvesting. We've looked at what parts of the ocean have the greatest harvests. Another way of divvying up is actually more basic, which is, how is this resource actually obtained? Is the resource obtained in the wild? Is this a fish that's caught with a hook or with a net somewhere in the open ocean? Or is this a resource that's farmed? Is this something that was fed and grown under human influence and then harvested in a controlled manner? And this actually turns out to probably be the most interesting story about marine biological resources over the course of our lifetimes. So if we just divvy up that sort of 140 million metric tons of biological resources harvested from the ocean, in terms of that basic division, is it wild, something that was caught, or is it something that was raised? You see a very different behavior as a function of time for those two divisions. The wild catch in the ocean increases gradually from something like 60 million tons up to roughly 80 or 90 million tons from the 1960s through the 1980s. And again, the data from China are a little bit suspect, but nonetheless, broadly speaking, this seems to be about right. And then it levels off. And in fact, over the last 20 years or so, the wild harvest from the ocean has essentially not changed. It goes up and down from year to year. Parts of the ocean become more productive or less productive, or become restricted legally, but nonetheless, the overall harvest seems to be roughly maxed out. And it's not like people aren't trying to get more out of the ocean, but that seems to be perhaps about as much as it can give us. The yield of biological resources from aquaculture, the underwater equivalent of agriculture, has, by contrast, been steadily increasing, almost exponentially increasing over time. And we're actually at the point today where aquaculture accounts for well over a third, perhaps something like 40% of the total harvest from the ocean. And you can see that this line is going up. There's no guarantee, of course, that it's going to keep going up in the same way, but if you extrapolate sort of naively, you can imagine a period sometimes something like 15 years in the future where the aquaculture yields from the ocean will actually surpass the wild yield from the ocean. So in our lifetime, sometime around when you guys are hitting middle age, the ocean will be transitioning from a place where people go to hunt to a place where people go to farm. We're domesticating the oceans, and it's happening as we speak. All right, so are there any questions so far? All right. So implicit in this idea that the wild yield harvest from the ocean is kind of as big as it seems to be able to get, or at least it hasn't been going up for the last 20 years, is this idea that, you know, maybe we're starting to overharvest from the ocean. Maybe we're taking too much stuff out of it. And this is a significant issue. In fact, it's a major issue, a major source of controversy. The idea there's a maximum sustainable capture from the ocean, which means if one person in another fishing boat gets too many fish, that's going to inhibit my ability in my own fishing boat to get as much as I want. And so this idea that there's a maximum sustainable capture, that there is a limit to the wild harvest of an organism that can be sustained over indefinite periods of time. Of course, if you go out in the ocean and you get every single individual of a particular species of fish, there's not going to be any left over to breed, and so the stock of that fish is going to collapse, and you can't come back the next year and harvest them again, certainly not in the same abundance, right? You can actually transition from a renewable resource where the fish are reproducing about as quickly as you're harvesting them to a non-renewable resource where the ability of the fish to reproduce is actually declining as a function of time, and you can no longer harvest at the level you once were. The estimated value of this for the ocean is probably less than this, but pretty close to what the harvest has been over the last 10 or 15 years. So it looks like really, if you just step back and say, what's the productivity of the ocean? How efficient is the transfer of stored energy from photosynthesis up through zooplankton up to fish that are actually commercially valuable? That number works out to be roughly about as much as we're getting out of the ocean. So humans are basically getting as much as it's willing to give us, at least on some sustainable basis. Now, the idea that there's a maximum level that you can harvest from the ocean sort of implies that you can go beyond that. You can overdo it. You can overfish. And there are various technical definitions of this, but the basic idea here is that if a fish stock is overharvested, the ability of that particular species in that particular region of the ocean to reproduce is actually declining over time. So the amount of new fish that are being generated is actually decreasing because you're harvesting so many of the mature ones. And of course, over time, as the breeding pool declines, that resource is going to decline with it. And this number is actually a little bit old. It might be out of date already. But the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration in the United States government estimates that something like a quarter of the U.S. fisheries are presently overfished. Globally speaking, it's actually much worse than that. The United States is a developed country. It's imperfect, our ability to regulate fishing activity, but there are mechanisms to do so, at least in some of the major fisheries, like off the coast of Alaska. And so you can imagine that in a part of the world where there isn't a strong government that can execute controls on the harvest, these problems might be even worse than they are in the U.S. coastal regions. And the common fix is kind of the obvious one. If a fishery is being overharvested, you reduce the harvest. You try to let that stock build up again until it recovers to the point where you can start harvesting at a more sustainable level and still achieve the economic results you need. Now, what happens if you don't implement a fix like that, or you don't get lucky for some other reason? You can actually achieve commercial extinction. This is distinct from actual extinction. We're not talking about necessarily harvesting every single living organism belonging to a particular species, but you can harvest so much of an organism that essentially it no longer makes any economic sense to try to catch it anymore. And this has actually happened repeatedly over the course of the history of fisheries. And an example would be the North Atlantic cod fishery, which was one of the reasons North America got explored in the first place. European fishermen in the late Middle Ages, after the Renaissance, were following the fish, and they actually followed them all the way across the Atlantic Ocean to places like the Grand Banks off of Newfoundland in maritime Canada. But by the mid to late 20th century, that cod fishery, which had driven the exploration in North America in part, had been depleted to the point where, in fact, the government of Canada essentially shut down fishing there, at least in the coastal waters, because it was no longer making any economic sense to continue to get fish from there. So that's kind of the bad result. In terms of global fish stocks, you can sort of make a classification between sort of a fishery that's not even really being utilized to its maximum sustainable ability, all the way up to a fishery that's been over-harvested so much that it's beginning to no longer make economic sense to try to harvest from it anymore. And what's plotted here is an attempt to graph up this relationship by a researcher at the University of Kiel going from 1950 until roughly the present day. And again, this is consistent with what we saw from the yield data from the wild catch, that since something like the mid-1980s, all of the major fisheries in the world have either been fully exploited, overexploited, or have actually been crashed. That the number of areas of the ocean that we're still exploring and where the yield of fish is increasing sustainably is actually small compared to the regions of the ocean where it's been overharvested to the point where it's not as productive as it once was. So not only are we probably harvesting about as much as we can from the ocean, evidence kind of is suggesting that we're harvesting more than the ocean can sustain in the long term. And over time, the yields from the ocean from wild catches is expected to decrease. All right, any questions about that? Okay, so what can be done? If we have a resource, which is an important resource, remember something like 1 in 5 grams of protein that humans eat comes from underwater somehow and mostly from the ocean. How do we deal with the fact that the ocean is kind of maxed out in its ability to provide those resources to us? And one way is, of course, improved fisheries management. To the extent we can take some of those fisheries that are now being over-harvested or have actually crashed and rehabilitate them, we may actually be able to increase the net harvest from the ocean, at least in the future. In addition, the growth area in terms of harvesting biological resources from the ocean is aquaculture, farming of the ocean. And that's a growth area. And it looks like that can actually grow for some time into the future. There are important issues involved that may limit its long-term ability to solve the problem, but nonetheless, it's still able to grow at least. And so we're going to talk about that in a little bit more detail. And in an older version of your book, I think there was a distinction made between aquaculture and mariculture. For the purposes of this class, I'm not really going to make much of a distinction. To the extent there is one, aquaculture is perhaps the more general term, but may also kind of imply freshwater. Mariculture specifically implies farming of saltwater. So for instance, a salmon farm like you might find off the coast of Canada, that would be an example of mariculture because it's in a saltwater environment. Okay. So mariculture, at least at present, is the farming of marine organisms, and this is usually done coastally. So this is a coastal process, usually done under pretty active human supervision in the vicinity of human population centers of one kind or another. Open ocean mariculture is being tried in various ways, but it's not a big player yet in terms of the amount of resource that's actually been harvested. Most mariculture today is focused on sort of high value organisms in the ocean. So things that command a premium just because of what kind of organism it is. So shrimp, salmon. There's ranching of tuna, which is a kind of mariculture, but it's a funny kind of mariculture, but that's another very valuable organism. Oysters, for instance. So the amount of material that's actually harvested from farming of the ocean is, in some sense, economically limited. It's farming of organisms not to make the maximum possible sustainable harvest, but actually to maximize the economic return from that harvest, which means focusing on species that are relatively easy to raise, but that can be sold for fairly high prices. And it really is a growth industry. As of 2003, it was a little less than a third of the global harvest. As of 2006, it had actually ticked up somewhat more to be closer to perhaps 40% of the global harvest. And it really is the growth segment of modern fishing. There are a few areas in the ocean that we're still learning how to exploit. There are species that are being fished now that weren't being fished 5 years ago for wild harvest from the ocean. But really the story of growth is in farming of the ocean. And this has actually been something of an economic lifeline for areas that used to be centered on wild harvest in the ocean, but where the fisheries have collapsed. And an example of that would be Bangladesh, which has a large population, is on the coast of a fairly productive part of the ocean, but that fishery has collapsed under overfishing pressure. And so the ability to control and increase the productivity of farmed fish from the ocean is kind of economically made up for that lack of a wild fishery or the collapse of the wild fishery. But there are downsides, or at least potential downsides, to the farming of the ocean. And in particular, it's that most of the farming at present is occurring in the coastal ocean, which has lots of importance not just for aquaculture, but also for the wild parts of the ocean. So remember that the coastal ocean, by and large, is the most productive part of the ocean, particularly of the wild ocean. It's where a lot of upwelling occurs, and it's an area where nutrients run off from the land. And it turns out that the coastal areas, for many species of economically important fish, are nurseries of one kind or another. That the fish spend an important part of their life cycle near the coast, even if they spend other parts of their life cycles offshore. And a good example of that would be the salmon, which lives most of its life in the ocean, more or less in the open ocean, but has to breed actually in freshwater. And so here's just a time-lapse photograph. This is a satellite image of the coastal area of Honduras in 1987 and in 1999. And pretty much all these kind of blue stripes here, these blue checks, are shrimp farms. And these are shrimp farms that are not offshore. They're actually built in sort of the estuary region where the saltwater and freshwater used to mix. And this is an important environment because it's highly productive. It's, in fact, naturally one of the most productive parts of the planet in terms of fixing of carbon by photosynthesis, and it's being converted. So that ability of the wild environment to produce is actually being impaired directly because it's being converted to a different use. In addition, maybe not so much of a problem here because there's not a big city here, but in areas where there is a substantial coastal population, these wetlands absorb things like tsunami and storm surges. By converting them to shrimp farms, that ability to absorb those kind of natural disasters before they reach population centers potentially gets impeded. Additional issues coming from aquaculture are just the byproducts of the aquaculture itself. So Atlantic salmon, almost everywhere you buy it, unless you catch it yourself or pay a lot of money for it, is farmed. Maybe not even farmed in the Atlantic. It may actually be farmed in the Pacific. And of course, there are economic issues. For instance, we of course like to buy nice pink salmon. We don't like gray salmon. And so the fish are actually fed a dye to make their flesh the same color as the wild salmon would be, which apparently wasn't done very well in this particular case. But in addition, the main protein source for many kinds of aquaculture is actually wild harvested fish. So the cheapest way to get protein into farmed salmon is actually to grind up trash fish that were collected from the wild in the ocean and feed them to the salmon. So in that sense, you're not actually increasing the net harvestability of biological resources from the ocean. You're just converting a less economic ton of fish into a more economically valued half ton of fish or less. You may actually be decreasing the sustainable harvest from the ocean that way. And the intensity of aquaculture has implications. So most salmon farming is done in sort of wave-protected, calm parts of the ocean because that's where, of course, you can keep things under control. But the density of those organisms can, for instance, cause incidence of disease, high population densities of parasites that may potentially pass through the farmed population into the wild population. And in particular for salmon farming, this is a major concern that in areas like the coast of BC, young fish migrating out to sea past these salmon farms may be picking up things like sea lice that normally don't inhabit baby salmon because the baby salmon are kind of spaced well apart from each other. But when the salmon swim by these really dense packed salmon farms, they pick up these parasites that may inhibit their ability to survive as wild organisms. All right. So I'll stop there. And we'll come back on Wednesday and talk about global climate change.